I'm thrilled to have all these wonderful people with me. In many ways, this is the equivalent of one of my favorite activities in life, which is to have dinner with a bunch of people who I know, but they don't really know each other. Because it really fosters interesting conversations, and in many ways it mirrors what we're trying to do with the Institute, which is to create what I like to call happy accidents or creative collisions, bringing people together, and magic happens often. So I'm hoping that this panel will provide that magic for you. In terms of the format, so this is actually the first time that we're doing this series with 5 panelists. We'll keep it informal and conversational. Imagine that you're just you're a fly on the wall in the dinner conversation that we're about to have, or the lunch conversation we just had. Hopefully, the panel is even more fun than the lunch. The lunch we had, because the lunch was awesome. And we'll leave the last half hour for questions. Liz unfortunately has to leave at 2, so if she gets up and leaves, it doesn't mean that she's not interested in what we're talking about. And I've also warned the same thing about you guys to the panel, that if around 10 till 2, some people start getting up and leaving, it's not because you're not interested, but it's because you have classes. So we understand. Okay, so I will just briefly turn it over so you guys can quickly introduce yourselves, and then we'll dive into all the fun stuff ahead. Liz, you want to kick it off?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Liz Powers, and I'm the co-founder and chief happiness spreader at Artlifting. So we help homeless and disabled artists sell their work. And when anyone hears that, they're like, wow, that's niche. But it's less niche than you might think. So I've worked with homeless individuals for the last 10 years, and my job used to be running art groups in shelters, primarily in Central Square. And I kept seeing so much amazing raw talent. One example is the black and white piece up there. So that was hand cut out of one sheet of black paper. And he just uses an X-Acto knife, and totally self-taught. So I kept seeing raw talent and thought, what a no-brainer to help sell it. Not only for the money, but even more importantly for the confidence built. And having someone recognize your talents instead of the negative of you don't have housing right now, or you're in a wheelchair, or for the, if you don't mind lifting that one up, for the orange piece here, the artist is nonverbal autistic, and he uses art to speak. So our goal is to focus on talents, and we've been able to scale up. We just started with $4,000 of our savings 2 years ago, and we're able to bootstrap to revenue in the 6 figures, and then do a seed round because we're a for-profit social enterprise, and now we've scaled to 10 cities. So we're psyched to keep growing and happy to answer questions.
And I know one of your investors is the founder of Tom Shoes, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Tony, it's an honor to have you here as well, all the way from Valencia, Spain.
I should Tony Woodcock, and I'm delighted to be here as well and having the opportunity of meeting all of you and speaking with you. I should explain, I missed the lunch for some reason, but it looked delicious. Panos is absolutely correct. It looked like a stunning lunch, and next time I'll be there in time to enjoy it as well.
I even organized it for you, man. But
yeah, I know you do that. And you do it so well. It's just my timing that's off. Up until last year, I was president of New England Conservatory of Music here in Boston. That's the other place across the street, and that was a fabulous time. I in fact spent the morning over there looking at the new build, which I helped to design, and that's going really swimmingly. It won't be as glorious as what has happened here with Berkeley, but it will be appropriate to the vision over there, which I think is a really strong one. In recent months, I have been doing a ton of other things with my life and my energies and enthusiasms, and have found myself in Valencia and being introduced to Berkeley in Valencia, and I'm proud to say that I'm now the visiting professor of music and social entrepreneurship there. And I'm looking forward to actually starting a new program sometime in the fall, together with my other work for a little enterprise that I have created called Scholarpax Arts around Europe and also in the States as well.
Thanks. And one of the things that I will throw out there, both Carla and Tony and I have been talking about the concept of starting a course here in Boston around music and social entrepreneurship. So if you're interested, please let me know. I'm ppanay at berkeley.edu, Ppanay at berkeley.edu. It's important for us to know your interest in a course like this, which, again, we would love to roll out pretty soon. Carla.
Thank you, Panos. My name is Carla Durlakova. I am a trained opera singer. I've been lucky to pursue this dream and sing professionally for about 12 years all over the world. It was my dream as a little girl to sing the role of Carmen, and that certainly was the vehicle for me in my career. But about 2 years ago, I started to feel very disconnected from my audiences and started to really question what is the role that arts can play in society outside of the traditional symphony, opera, ballet spheres of classical music. And at the time, I was extremely lucky in that I got a phone call from the Sphinx organization telling me that I had won their Medal of Excellence. So that was really, for me, kind of a call to action to ask these questions out loud and think about where I could make a difference and also what was motivating me. And as it turned out, although I love to sing, I had changed, and I think my motivation really became about helping people. So that has led me to found my own organization, a nonprofit called the Canales Project, with the mission of exploring issues of identity and culture through music and conversation. And this is in part just my own way of opening up my story, my vulnerability, and my questions of identity, which as I started to discuss with people, I realized I wasn't the only one. My story is that my mother is Mexican, my father is Bulgarian, and I've spent most of my life checking the other box on the US Census Bureau. And as I found out, actually we're looking at 2020 being the year when children 18 and under in America, the minority will be the majority. So there's a definite shift in our demographic, and I believe that music and the arts can be a huge tool in helping have this conversation, in helping create bridges, and ultimately in helping us come together as human beings. That's the place to start. So that's a big part of my life. The singing is still a big part of my life, and I also work as an advocate with a number of organizations, including the President's Committee for the Arts and the Humanities, Americans for the Arts, and so on. So I've been very lucky, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Panos.
Thank you, Carla. Julie.
I'm Julie Levin. I am the founder, artistic, and executive director of Shelter Music Boston, which is an organization that presents classical chamber music concerts in shelters, homeless shelters, and other sheltering environments throughout the greater Boston area. I'm also a trained violinist, and I have been performing as a violinist since I finished school at Oberlin. And I work down the street at Symphony Hall. Often I play in the Boston Pops, I play in the Handel and Hyde Society, I play a great deal of chamber music in other venues. Like Carla, I had a moment of wondering how I could make my music and my passion for classical music more relevant and perhaps meld it with my desire to see and work for social justice. And so I founded Shelter Music Boston to take the concerts into shelters, to remove the exclusivity that can sometimes be associated with classical music, and bring a very high quality product on a regular basis into shelters. In fact, our organization is sort of the idea of a chamber music ensemble in residence at a homeless shelter. We perform at our shelters once a month. So we are returning regularly to the same shelters, and we are building relationships with this community. Currently we serve 7 shelters in Greater Boston with a classical music concert each month. And over the almost 6 years that we have been doing this, we have had tremendous response from the shelter guests, from the shelter staff, and from the social innovation community, as well as the arts community, seeing that we've created a model where musicians are working in shelters. We see our services on the spectrum of what a social worker and a psychiatrist bring to the shelter, a humane interaction with someone who is currently homeless, who seeks support to move out of homelessness. And with music, we create a community that supports respectful, dignified interaction, that offers the shelter guests access to great art, to the human dignity and community that can be experienced together. Our concerts are very interactive in that we consistently ask for the audience to tell us what they think about the music. And we encourage people, even if you don't like this music, let us know what you think, because it's very unusual for anyone to look a homeless individual in the eye and say, "What do you think? I value your opinion." So that is a foundation for our work, and I look forward to questions later. Thank you.
David.
Good afternoon. My name is David France, and I'm a violinist and the founder and executive director of Revolution of Hope, which exists at the intersection of music and social change. And it sounds like a lot of people have been talking about turning points. And so for myself, I grew up as a violinist, and when I was young, my black friends and my white friends, they all told me that playing the violin was for white people. And then eventually even my own teachers, they didn't believe that I was gonna do anything with the violin because I was black. And so I found myself really like fighting institutions, really demanding the education that was promised me. And so 2009 was a huge turning point for me. I was living in Bermuda, and the website YouTube had the first ever international competition that anybody could audition for. They were trying to create the first ever orchestra audition on the internet. It was called the YouTube Symphony. And I thought, okay, this is my chance. All I have to do is just practice more than everyone else in the world. And so, long story short, I won, and I got to be one of the 5 concert masters of the YouTube Symphony. So every news channel from all around the world was just like, how is this guy from Bermuda? Like, how did he get into this orchestra? And I was getting all these interviews. And I started to articulate this idea, and I said, yeah, this is really cool. It's really great to be on the stage at Carnegie Hall, but what about all the people in communities who don't have access to the kind of training that I fought for, or that I clawed my way to get? And around that same time, I fell upon a bunch of videos out of Venezuela where they were using orchestras in Venezuela to transform communities, and I thought, that's what I want to do. So I moved to Boston and was a part of the New England Conservatory's El Sistema Fellowship Program, and really found this thing I'd been looking for of like, how can I use this tool of music to really transform communities? So I graduated, and now for the last 3 years, Revolution of Hope, our first project, is called the Roxbury Youth Orchestra. And what it is, it's a 5-day-a-week for 3 hours a day after school youth orchestra in Roxbury, used to transform the lives of inner city kids. I kind of thought, in a city like Boston or any other city with all these great programs, I thought something great should also exist in the communities of people who live in the hood. And so that's what I do.
And David, I will give you a lot of credit actually for even inspiring this topic. 2 years ago, David and I met, and he invited me to come and speak to the young students that you teach at Roxbury, and it blew me away that it's about 1.5 miles from here, just the different world that they inhabit, but in many ways, the amazing power that music had over bringing us together. And to this day, it's maybe one of the, if not the most touching moment that I ever had in my life. And I speak at many events and I speak to a lot of people, but it really grabbed me. And I'll also want to quickly acknowledge that in the audience, we have one of our own students. Louis, if you want to stand up real quick. Louis started a nonprofit out of a class that we teach for the Institute called the Startup Lab. He started a project where he extends scholarships to Bolivian students to come and study at different academic institutions around America. But he was named recently Person of the Year in Bolivia, correct? And what they do is absolutely amazing. Please check out the BerkleeICE website for a lot of stuff about Louis. But again, it's these insights both from within the Berkeley community that have asked for this to happen, and also the amazing success that people like Louis are having, and also my encounters with all the people here that have been so inspiring. So I'll start by throwing this question out to, I'll start with Tony, but please, everybody should jump in because we want to make this a conversation and not going down, seat by seat, if you will. But what is it that makes arts and music in particular such a powerful source of change and social impact? There's obviously a lot of money that gets spent on a lot of these different topics. There's a lot of programs. But what is it that makes music and the arts so uniquely qualified to advance these issues?
I think that music can be those things. David's program is very aptly named, Revolution and Hope, and that's really what it should be about. I think often the major resources for music go towards what I would describe as a social and economic elite, and that is probably in the unequal world that we live in, that's not the best investment. So I'm a huge believer in the arts. I'm a huge believer in the power of music to transform, to heal, to change the world in which we live. And I think we have an opportunity now with new thinking, with social entrepreneurship becoming, I think, a major driving force in much of the world, certainly in South America and in many of the new developments that I see. We have an opportunity to start a new direction, and a direction which I think could take us in a very interesting way. So it probably wasn't the answer you were expecting.
But don't expect answers. I just ask questions.
I'd like to offer something just from my experience, playing in shelters, creating hope, and in fact saving lives. We had at our concert in this past July, actually my colleague Rebecca Strauss is here, who was performing in that concert in the Caspar shelter, which is in Cambridge. Caspar is a shelter that will shelter people who are actively abusing substances. It is their model to meet people exactly where they are, to assist them in hopefully taking the first step towards sobriety. So it's a very rough environment. And there was a gentleman who sat next to me. I wasn't performing that concert, but I was there. And this young man said to me after the concert, "I think you might have saved a life with this concert, because I was so angry and frustrated when I came in here tonight. I didn't know what I was going to do." And I know that this gentleman had access to a way to end his life, probably in his bag, because everyone is carrying substances that can accomplish that. And he said, music and math can really do this. And so what my experience and understanding about what music, the change that music can create, like math, it's highly structured. And for our audiences, something with a reliable structure actually provides some comfort and solace. And in fact, hope that they can move on. As well, there are no words. No one's talking to them in the music. And everyone can bring to music whatever is true for that person. And that's something we encourage in our concerts. Whatever you think is the right answer for you, because you think it. And that empowers people. And when people are empowered, they do feel hopeful, and then we can create change with the arts. Liz's work, these artists are empowered to feel human.
I'm also curious from Carla and David. One of the things that dawned on me as everybody was introducing themselves is that, actually this is by sheer coincidence, almost all of you work in, I'll call it the classical music realm, which is something a bit different for us at Berkeley. Is there something about classical music, or even the redefinition of what classical music really means, that makes it perhaps more broadly universal?
Go ahead.
Carla, go.
Okay.
I'll throw it to you.
Well, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and it's often said that music is the universal language. I disagree with that statement. I believe that the universal is our capacity to feel emotion. And that's what I've seen in my travels. I've worked mostly internationally, and oftentimes, Western classical music could be very different from Chinese traditional music and so on. But we all laugh, we love, we cry, we feel pain, we feel joy, we feel. That's what makes us human. And also, of course, the capacity to think about how we feel and reflect on it. And I see the arts, and perhaps music in a particular way, as a tool for us to reflect on our emotion. And so this, to me, is the great power of the arts. Now, in terms of classical music, something could be said. There could be an argument about the universality, the themes, going back to structure and so forth, that classical music has tended to provide in that regard. But I've always approached it that music is music. Even though I am a classically trained musician, I like to think of myself as a singer. And to me, when I sort of bring it to that base level of singing, well, anybody can sing, right? If you can speak, you can sing. Just like if you can walk, you can run. So I suppose what I'm trying to say in the end is that what I'm interested in at a time where there is so much differentiation in our country, in the world, I'm interested in going back to some of the things that we have in common, our commonalities as humans. Again, singing for me is one of those because it's something that we all have access to. And I start from there. And my goal is never to try to convert someone to opera per se. Rather, I would say my goal is to listen and try to learn something from the people that I'm working with. And I take that in a sort of incubator that is my mind, my instrument, all of it. And that's where the innovation can happen. If I were to go out with this mission of promoting classical music or opera, to me it would be backward, because then I wouldn't necessarily be learning anything. And how can we build that trust? How can we make progress if we're closed? So I guess these are just some thoughts about my own approach, but I'm interested to hear what everyone else has to say.
Yeah, David, I'm curious, and I'm somebody that tends to reject labels. Really, music is music. I personally don't necessarily always think of music in labels. I just know what I like or what I don't like. But you obviously have a fairly unique approach to the way that you're tackling this. So curious in your thoughts about whether the type of music that you use influences your ability to reach the audience that you're trying to reach. And especially since you're dealing with a lot of young people, for example, do you think you would have been equally impactful if you were using, jazz or hip hop or rock music?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, and I'm really fortunate to have how Tony set us up for this conversation. I think of water often, and water you can either sustain someone with water or you can drown someone with water. And so this thing can be positive or it could be negative. And I think it's kind of how you use the thing. And so when having it be music, I think a music can bring people together or music can divide people. And I think we've seen that in classical music. We've seen classical music divide people, and we've seen classical music bring people together. I had an amazing experience after I graduated from the fellowship at the New England Conservatory. I had a chance to travel to Poland. And I was going on tour to Poland, and so the tour director said, learn some Chopin. So I learned a Chopin nocturne in C sharp minor for violin, and I was at a high school, large high school, and it was announced that I was there, that a violinist was in the high school, and if anyone wanted to collaborate, there he is. And I was the only black person in Poland, so that was easy to find. So I couldn't speak any Polish, but at the end of the assembly, a bunch of these high school kids brought this kid to me, and they just pushed him forward. He couldn't speak any English, and they said, he plays the piano. And I had the piano part to the Chopin nocturne piece. And so here's this kid, this scrawny Polish kid who plays the piano, and this big black guy who plays the violin. And we put the music on the stand, and there was all this talking in the auditorium, and we started playing this nocturne. And all of a sudden, everyone just went completely silent, because the music connected us. The music became this natural bridge that because even though we didn't have the same language, the music connected us. And that music, it didn't have to connect us, but it did. And that was really amazing an experience for me. And that was really a model for how I run my program now. So even though we use elements of classical music, that music, we see it as a bridge to connecting people. And right now we practice in a cafeteria at a school in Roxbury. And it's what I've noticed in the past 2 years in this cafeteria, a lot of the students at the school, they've chosen to study in the cafeteria where we practice. So they're there with all their books and they're just studying. And then about 6 months into us being there, a group of the guys who were sitting in the corner every day just kind of laughing and joking, they started doing a beat on the cafeteria table to our classical music. And then a couple weeks later, they started, and they were just kind of really silent. They started freestyle rapping to our Pachelbel's canon. And it was really amazing because here's this classical music, but now it's on their terms. Not only it's in their neighborhood, it's in their school, it's in their study space, and they could do with it whatever they wanted to do with it. And so I don't think it's the style of music, but I think it's the packaging. And I think if you package music as a bridge, then it can connect people.
It's interesting to have this conversation given our Hamilton the musical discussion at lunch, which we won't go into right now. But I had a firsthand experience of this. Before I started the Institute here at Berkeley, I started and ran a company called Sonic Bids. And I remember the first time that I was in Seville, Spain, I met this young female Iranian DJ. And you can put these three words together, and in and of itself is revolutionary. But she said, you know, this is the first time that I'm able to travel outside of Iran and come to, it was called WOMEX, or World Music Expo, and perform. And in many ways, music was the language that she was using to both communicate but also import a totally new world into her reality. And shifting a bit from music, going to Liz, I'm curious, Liz, was there a turning point for you where you felt that art can be such a powerful medium, not only of expression, but also of personal transformation? And to paraphrase, Tony writes a great blog for Huffington Post, and his latest blog, which is on social entrepreneurship, he talked about a gap of opportunity and a gap of hope. So I'm curious from your standpoint, you know, when was that turning point where you felt, wow, this can be such a powerful medium to get people over that gap of hope and opportunity?
And I love the connection there. I mean, hope is the theme across the whole room right now. And before running art groups and shelters, I was doing casework. So I had one-on-one meetings, and I was helping get housing, jobs, very, very practical things. But so many clients said to me during those one-on-ones that, you know, Liz, I feel incredibly lonely. And that really stuck with me. Obviously, it hit me emotionally, but also from a big picture level, it was like, okay, this isn't rocket science. If back to back people keep saying they're lonely, how can I figure out a way to bring them together to support one another? And that was a big turning point of, okay, well, we could, you know, sit in a stale room with, you know, seats like this and try to have a listening and support group. But first of all, I'm not going to be able to convince anyone to come. And second of all, even if they came, I'm not going to convince anyone to talk. To give a little context there, 50% of homeless women have experienced domestic violence. So thinking of, you know, sitting in a room like this and being able to talk about your experiences, you know, you're so vulnerable, you don't know the other people there. It takes time to earn trust and to open up. And since I'd been an artist my whole life, I thought, what a no-brainer to just sit around a table in a shelter, put art supplies out there. It's not an art class. It's simply a way to come together. And that was a big turning point of, you know, so many eventually it was, not like overnight success at all. Took a lot of time to build up, but then so many women had never painted before, or it had been many, many years. I was at shelters in Central Square, and they said to me, Liz, what should I paint? I have no idea. And I always said, paint hope. And that was really interesting to see, because sometimes it was a self-portrait, sometimes it was a sunset, sometimes it was crazy abstract. And it was really neat for me to see, this whole evolution of what hope means to each person. But another big turning point was, equally valuable of having that self-expression is having someone see it and having someone recognize your talents. And, that big, I had like a ton, so I grew up going to Catholic school, and I had, a lot of Catholic guilt in me right after I'd started, going for, thinking, okay, I'm going to start art groups, but I don't know how, so I'm going to spend a whole month researching and talking to art therapists and talking to people who have been in the field for decades, because I'm super aware that I'm naive. And so that was when I was 22, and Harvard had agreed to pay my salary for a year to start up these art groups. And I had this oh my gosh moment, because even though I was just in Central Square, I had no idea there were 6 shelters in Boston that already had art groups. And I had written this whole essay about the need, and it's oh my goodness, I could have been referring people, a 10-minute bus ride away. So I think those moments of, being super aware that how little you know and how much you need to listen to the community and to everyone around you. But that was another huge turning point of, okay, I've been in the field for 4 years. I had no idea these art groups exist. And a normal person really has no idea these art groups exist. So we need to create a marketplace to share this talent.
Tony, I know you've been, an early proponent of El Sistema and played a big role in importing it to the United States. Can you talk a bit about what that is? I'm not sure if a lot of people in the audience are familiar with it, and also how you incorporate it within NEC and the curriculum you developed there.
I'll give you my elevator speech on El Sistema, and David might want to, and see Ariel, who is another fellow, is there as well, who might want to add to this. But El Sistema is an educational phenomenon which has been in existence now for 40 years and was created in, of all places, Caracas, Venezuela. And if you've been to Caracas, Venezuela, you will know how extraordinary that statement is. And it was imagined and then executed by an amazing individual called Jose Antonio Abreu, who was a conductor, a teacher, but was also a politician who worked on the cabinet level of 6 governments in Venezuela, if you can imagine what that must be like. I always described him as being perhaps one of the greatest diplomats of all time. And what he imagined was the power of music. And he invited about 17 kids to join him in his garage 40 years ago. And he got them to play a little ensemble. And then the next week there were 20, and the week after that there were 25, and after that it grew, and it grew. Until today, in this program, and what David described his program as being is very much a El Sistema-inspired model of all of that. What he's able to boast today is a program that touches the lives of more than 300,000 young people in an intensive after-school 5-day-a-week program, often 7-day-a-week program. 70% of the people, of the kids, are underprivileged. They come from the poorest barrios ever. And the power of this teaching method and what it has demonstrated, not just to the kids who are part of this, because what they're doing is a circular model of support. So you're aged 5, you learn to play the violin pretty well. Aged 9, you're even better. So you start teaching the 5-year-olds. So it's a virtuous circle of support, which is astonishing. And the effect it had not just upon the kids and their self-image, their creativity, their confidence, but the effect it had upon families. All of a sudden, the families, the siblings would be saying, well, he's playing the violin or the flute or the drums, whatever it is, and he's being pointed out as being someone extraordinary in our community. I want to be like that. Positive reinforcement. The father would stop drinking and would stop abusing the mother. And you were getting something that was really touching upon, it's not just social justice in that these opportunities need to be available, but it was touching upon true social change. I know that country has so many problems, and it's not being helped now with what's happening with oil prices and all the rest of it. But they actually taught the so-called developed world a thing or two about what you can do with music. And I felt so inspired when I went there for the very first time in 2007 and was asked by Abreu to start this special elite training program to train 50 outstanding young leaders in this field for North America, not necessarily to go back into South America or to parts of Europe or Asia, but specifically for North America. When I began that relationship, there were about 6 sort of Sistema-like entities in North America. Now I've counted over 100, am I right with that? Maybe 200 now, the last time I haven't looked at it for a few months, but it has been developing in the most exponential and exciting way. And the program that NEC invented and supported has been a backbone, a real fundamental backbone to all of those things.
Was it a natural for a conservatory like NEC to embrace something like this? Because it does call for people to think outside of the normal parameters of why they go to a music college.
Yeah, it had its moments of tension, I have to say. But I think what was inspiring was the first time I went, I took a whole group of politicians and major donors with me. Major donors who I knew were very sympathetic to this type of social change and this type of education. And when you put somebody in a room with 80 kids who are playing their hearts out, and you can see how bad the shoes are and the dress and the pants and all the rest of it. You can see what home life must be like, and all of a sudden they're in love with music and they're in love with their instrument, and then you see these people quite naturally get very, very emotional, and you can turn to them at that moment of inflection and say, we should be doing something about this, shouldn't we? And they're saying, yeah, let's talk about it.
You brought up something interesting that I know, David is very active on Indiegogo for raising funds, and of course both Carla and Julie and I have spoken about both the challenges that exist out there in terms of going out there and soliciting prospective donors and funders for programs like this. I'm just curious, what is your experience as a social entrepreneur, and what is the environment out there like in terms of supporting initiatives like this? And then I'll go back to Liz, because unlike the rest of the panel, you actually run a social good enterprise that is a for-profit. But I'll start with Carla and Julie and take it from there.
Well, it's tough out there, I have to say. I have been lucky to have gone through a nonprofit accelerator program, the Social Innovation Forum, which meant that I got to be in front of philanthropists and give a pitch that was airtight, with scientific information and social information and emotional information about our program. And people said, and then I could say, we should be doing something about this. And they indeed said, yes, we should. And especially, like your people you just illustrated, when I can convince someone to come with me to the shelter and see what's going on, what happens when someone hears classical music in the shelter, when the place becomes calm instead of the arrests that might be going on in the background or the fights that aren't breaking out, people say, yes, we should do something about this. So it's really about building the relationships around the issue and getting people to understand. Now, being an unusual and a somewhat innovative program, there's a huge learning curve for people. And so that is a constant work of building relationships, educating people, breaking down people's assumptions about what classical music is, who it's for, who it's not for. We feel, I'm sure everyone in this room feels that the arts are for everyone, and there's something wrong with our society if there's exclusivity. So in all cases of fine art, there's a great deal of fundraising that goes on, and that should include access for all. So these are the kinds of issues that I bring to people, and it really is matchmaking. When the mission resonates for someone, they are so happy to be able to make it happen, because they can't play the violin in the homeless shelter, but they can help me play the violin, and they can have the impact. And people want to have a positive impact. Increasingly, it's important to corporations, to individuals, to philanthropic organizations to have a greater social conscience.
And you also have an interesting model, because you insist that the musicians that perform these concerts are compensated versus asking them to do it on a charitable basis. I'm just curious, what's the motivation for that?
Well, musicians are highly trained professionals who need work. And in our society, we as artists are responsible for keeping our art form relevant, and that means we need to invent new places where our art form is relevant and in use and performed at the professional standard. Also, I use the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program as a model for my organization. Like El Sistema, it's about 40 years old, and it was started very clearly with the model that all homeless individuals deserve access to the highest quality health care, and they deserve dedicated staff and to build a relationship with a physician who will care for them consistently every time they show up at that healthcare facility. Not volunteers who come and go, who aren't willing to build relationships, who aren't willing to do this work. And it is work. This is not work for every concert musician. It is a very specific kind of work to invest in communities that need the hope and justice that arts can provide. So absolutely, I compensate the musicians because they are working.
Carla, you and I have had plenty of conversations, and you've used a term that I like that people don't often are sort of come into contact with while at college, which is cultural diplomacy, and it's a term that I really like. And most of the panelists are American, and I think that America is known both for its hard power and its soft power. And in many ways, I think that the country and often our government tends to underestimate the impact of soft power. And being a foreigner myself, I know that what made me want to move to America was watching as a young 5-year-old an Elvis Presley movie called King Creole, and being captivated by the music and this magic of what, not only Elvis, but America stood for. Because for me, Elvis was America, and it still is. But that's a whole different panel. Curious about your approach with respect to cultural diplomacy, and also any interesting transformative moments you've experienced being out there. And I know you've been in dozens and dozens of countries.
Yeah, well, for me, this started through a unique opportunity that I've been a part of for about 10 years, and that is a program through the State Department called the Cultural Envoy Program. This is just an amazing program, which now is actually endangered because of funding restrictions. But essentially, when I would go to do an opera or concert, let's say in China, having done a few of these, I was given this title of cultural envoy, and so I was, asked to contact the local embassy and let them know that I was in town. If I had a few extra days, they would send me on essentially missions. So this could be anything and everything. Sometimes it would be going into rural communities and performing. Sometimes it would be doing a master class for orphans or children who did not necessarily have access to the arts. All kinds of different activities. So, for instance, just to tell you a story, on one of my very first missions, it was 2006, I think, in Mexico, and the embassy said, well, there's this area called Campeche, and we don't usually send anyone there, and there's not a lot there, so why would you be willing to go? And I said, of course. And essentially we got there, and there were no facilities, there was no place. They thought maybe this was a terrible idea that they had brought me here. And I noticed a group of kids basically playing on the street. And it struck me that they were very united as a group. And I got to know them, again, through a lot of listening. And I asked them how they felt about music. And they said, well, we love music, but we don't have any instruments. So we started a choir with those kids. And as it turned out, a large percentage of the kids, about 85%, were orphaned kids that just came there every day to play through the services that were provided. So essentially we formed this chorus, and to make a long story short, I had them perform a concert with me at the end of the 5 days that we worked together, and invited a number of politicians and philanthropists to come and see this. And they went, wow. And I said, I'd like to come back in 6 months, because if there's one thing I believe with this kind of work, I am inclined not to do what I call one-offs. I think it's very important to give the work continuity. That's a part of the trust building. It's one thing to go into a community and perform and have a great day, but I think in terms of really building something and creating hope, that comes from a lasting relationship. So I had asked to go back 6 months later. 6 months later, we did another concert. 6 months after that, they opened for Andrea Bocelli. And 2 or 3 years after that, I want to say 2.5 years after that, they won an award called the Coming Up Taller Award at the White House, and they actually went to the White House to receive the award. So this was all through, the Cultural Envoy program, and I did these kinds of activities in China and South America and so forth. And it got me thinking a lot about cultural diplomacy, and also taking note of great artists that were themselves diplomats, Pablo Neruda and Gabriela Mistral and so many others, in one way or another, even Pablo Picasso. And sort of the artist, the civic responsibility in advocacy, and the musician's desire to participate on a greater scale. I think to some of the comments that you're stating, it was for me very hard when I was in school, because I was told, just go to the practice room, don't ask questions, practice and wait for your lucky break. Okay. So maybe I lucked out and I got a lucky break or two and I've been singing. But the bottom line is that is not a sustainable business model. That's not a plan. And what happens after your lucky break? And what happens 20 years after your lucky break? So one of the things that I think is so important is for young students, young musicians, to really think about themselves as entrepreneurs, artists as entrepreneurs, and to make a plan. And some of the business tools that I've learned, just some of the lingo, has helped me tremendously as an artist, which I'm still active as, and of course as an entrepreneur. Things like, what's your 1 year? What's your 5 year? What's your 10-year plan? What's your SWOT? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. The ROI. I'm constantly thinking in terms of the ROI for myself as an artist. And it's that path that really led me to this entrepreneurial venture. But ultimately, I go back to the diplomacy piece, because that's where I see potential for global change. And I do think we're living in a time of globalization. My parents, as I mentioned, come from these different countries, and they met at a time where there was no internet. I mean, the likeliness of my existing or being born in America is probably a very, very small statistical number. But now we're seeing more and more the globalization and the ideas that really anything is possible with the internet. So with that comes a sort of clash of culture. And I think of culture as belief systems. So I think of cultural entrepreneurship as an opportunity to change belief systems. And that's why I think cultural entrepreneurship, cultural diplomacy is so critical right now.
Just to translate, ROI is return on investment.
Yes, thank you.
A term you'll be asked about just about all the time after you leave college, whether you're working for somebody or starting your own business or starting a nonprofit. Liz, I know you have to leave in a few minutes, so I want to ask you this question. So speaking of ROI and SWOT analyses and all this other stuff, you decided to start a business that has a social and cultural impact, but yet, unlike the traditional route, which is to do it as a nonprofit, you decided to do it as a for-profit. And there's a few interesting things at play that I want you to talk a bit about. Number one, you're in an area that probably a lot of traditional investors would say, what? Homeless art? Also, you are a young woman entrepreneur that's going into a space that's often, and this is well documented, right? Especially when it comes to raising money, that has sometimes its own challenges and prejudices. So I'm curious about your journey, both as a woman entrepreneur, and I'm proud that this panel is 50-50. Actually, it's more than 50-50 because I'm not really a part of the panel. But also, why the decision to start a for-profit business versus a nonprofit?
Sure. Yeah, and just to give a little more context there, so 3% of venture capital funded companies have a female CEO. So that, and there's been a lot of articles about that this year, just to fill everyone in. So I've worked with nonprofits for 8 years before starting Artlifting, and I thought a lot about what should we create Artlifting as, and I thought about the potential as a nonprofit and potential as a for-profit. There were many reasons why we went for it. One reason was from a philosophical level of, I have so many friends in amazing nonprofits, and I'm sure on the panel we'd all agree how hard it is to get money. And I hate the concept of all these amazing organizations having to fight for this pot of gold, basically, which means all foundation grants and all corporate grants and individual grants all together. And obviously many nonprofits earn revenue, so that's not the only option for money. But thought, okay, I've talked to individuals for so long who are homeless and disabled, and they've said to me over and over, Liz, I don't want another handout. I don't want someone to give me another sandwich. I simply want an opportunity. And that got me thinking of, this word dignity that we've been talking about. Well, the ultimate dignity is having a job and having someone pay you for your talent instead of feeling like a charity case. So it was for two reasons. So number one, I didn't want to have that fight for getting grants anymore. And I think, anyone who's starting a social good organization that can generate income and not rely on grants should do it, because there are so many existing organizations that can't generate income and need to rely on those grants. So from just how are we going to change society the largest together, that's a great way of a home for domestic violence victims. It's very, very hard for them to generate income to pay for the house and pay for the food every day. But for us, I thought, why not just create a normal gallery? And normal galleries have 50-50 splits, and that's treating our artists with the dignity that they deserve and treating them as professionals. So we started as a benefit corporation, and it's really worked well. Just as I was
Can you
mentioning,
elaborate a bit on that? Because some of the business students in the audience know about a C corporation, they know about an LLC, they know about an S corporation, they know about a sole proprietorship, but B Corp is something pretty new. Can you explain what a B Corp is?
Yeah, so benefit corporation is an incredibly new entity, and it's very confusing. So like Warby Parker I bet a lot of you guys know. There are probably some Warby Parker glasses in the room. So they're a pretty well-known B Corp. But they're actually legally registered as a C corporation, so that just means a normal business. But they have this certification called benefit corporations. But there's a second kind of benefit corporation, which we are, which is we have a legally binding social mission. And that when Warby was starting, that didn't exist. So it's incredibly new and up and coming. We're filed out of Delaware as a business.
But you pay taxes as a regular for-profit company.
Exactly, yeah. So, like, what does that mean, having a legally binding social mission? That means if, once we got investors, so we got $1.3 million in investment this summer, we can choose to, normally as a C corporation, you always need to maximize the investor's return. But as a B corporation, you can choose cases where you're maximizing your social mission instead of their return.
How is a social mission quantified, though? So we're talking about ROI, return on investment, return on invested capital. But sometimes when it comes to a social impact, it's often difficult to quantify, or is it?
It's incredibly difficult to quantify. So we measure our impact in two ways. One is obviously the income earned by the artists, and the other is the confidence that's built. And we've had 5 artists gain housing so far. And that's certainly not just because of the money. It's because of the domino effect of positivity, of all of a sudden, instead of focusing on my weaknesses, someone's seeing me as a person and seeing my talents. And now I have the energy to do all these housing applications and get a side job at a nail salon or whatever it might be. So that's something we struggle with, is how do you quantify confidence change? We have surveys that we're trying out now of measuring confidence when artists start, and then 6 months in, and then a year in. But that's, you'd think, as putting an investor hat on, well, that sounds pretty risky, investing in a benefit corporation, because I want my return maximized. Like, this is insane. Why would I invest in this? But just for a little context around that, advisors said to me, try to go for $500,000, but it's going to take at least 6 months because you are such a weird company. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I never denied I'm weird. But it was, a big learning curve. But we were able to raise the $1.3 million in a month, largely because I could, look at organizations like Tom's, and I, argued, well, they bootstrapped, and they, bootstrapped to a valuation of $660 million, specifically because of their social mission. Because the vast majority of consumers want to buy from socially conscious companies. So I pitched us not as an art company, because the art market is so saturated, and it's really hard to have recurring income there, but as a social branding company. And we can, not just sell art prints, but also iPhone cases with our artwork on it, and do licensing deals, imagining, art lifting art on a line of Nike shoes or a Ralph Lauren dress line. So once I pitched it in that sense to investors, they were like, oh, I get it. Yeah, you can help me make a lot of money specifically because of your social mission, which is great. And I think a lot of people, have the gut reaction of, since it's traditional to social mission equals nonprofit, people have the gut reaction of, wait, for-profit working with homeless individuals, are you trying to exploit them? And that's obviously the last thing we're trying to do. But there is, once you're entering into new fields like this, you sign yourself up for that education and, putting yourself in the hot seat, and people can vilify me, but I'm ready for it. And whenever you make a change, you have to be ready for attackers too.
Thank you.
Can I just add a little?
Of course.
So I just want to piggyback on that, in that Shelter Music Boston is a social service agency. It is not a performing arts presenter. So I very much appreciate how you framed all that, because I think that way too, and that is what gives us, in for Shelter Music Boston, access to a lot of other potential funding, because we are a social service. Concerts as social service, not as
I want to add to that by saying Sistema in Venezuela wasn't funded by the education department, it was funded by social services.
And just to add to that, even El Sistema is now on 6 of the 7 continents on the planet. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. It has changed the world, which is fantastic.
Well, Liz, I know you have to go, so we'll thank you. We're sorry we're to see you leave because you're adding a lot, but we'll continue this conversation. So if anybody wants to check out Liz's company, it's called Artlifting, artlifting.com. Going right back, I think that, well, at least that's my perception, but it seems that for all of the issues that our world is dealing with, and obviously I started this very panel by talking about the terrorist attacks in Brussels, and it's something that we live with every day. We've experienced our own here literally on this street about 5 blocks away 3 years ago. Do you feel that society is becoming more empathetic somehow? Do you feel that because of the proliferation of connectedness, whether it's social media, whether it's globalization, whether it's even the ability for us to have instant global brands of artists and musicians, are we somehow becoming more empathetic? Are your respective causes benefiting from this? Or do you feel the opposite is happening? Are we, because of the proliferation of people walking down the street, and this is maybe the most annoying thing that I observe, everybody just looking at their phones all the time while they're walking. Do you think that we're becoming more isolated and less likely to be empathetic and support causes like the ones you're involved in?
I think that we can believe whatever we want to believe. I was catching the subway in New York City yesterday morning, and I have the worst sense of direction you could possibly imagine. I don't know which way up is. And I wanted to make certain I was going towards Manhattan, so I thought I would ask somebody. And I realized I couldn't ask anyone because they all had buds in their ears. They were tuned elsewhere. And and maybe that's something about, we've become very solipsistic, I think, in our approach to society and ourselves. And that Andy Warhol thing about 50 minutes of fame, it's no longer 50 minutes of fame. We can be famous all day long now because of technology. We can be famous not just in our own lunchtimes, but throughout the day. It's absolutely there for us. I think we've been hedging around a term which we actually haven't used yet, but we've sort of described it. We've talked really about poverty. How do we face up to the idea of poverty? 40% of the world is in poverty. Another 20% is in deep poverty. And we don't really understand what that means. Deep poverty is living on less than $1 a day. Deep poverty is not knowing where you can get drinking water that hasn't got cholera in it. Now, you could say, well, it's always been like that. And because we live in a capitalist global world, we could say, well, you know, for the 40% who benefit, who have this incredible lifestyle and have buds in their ears in a subway in New York City, that's the cost of doing business. Accept it. Be real. Get with it. Or you could say, what a fucking waste of a human asset. Because if you think of poverty, nobody chooses poverty. Absolutely no one. It's an externally imposed phenomenon. Just like a kid who's born to rich people hasn't chosen that. It's a mistake of birth. Perhaps mistake isn't the right word, but it has happened.
Genetic lottery winning.
Great, I love that one. What's the acronym? We got to do the acronym on that. It has to
GLW.
it has to be tweeted that immediately. So if you've got this amazing asset of somebody called a person and their brief time on this planet, how can you allow them to flourish and to be the amazingly talented, intuitive, entrepreneurial entity that they really are? And there are so many examples of that. Grameen Bank is one. Malala is another. The guy who fitted hole. Do you know the story of hole-in-the-wall computers in India?
No.
And he left them there, wondering what would happen. And he allowed 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds to play with them, and they worked it out. These kids in poverty worked it out. And when he spoke to them, he said, well, the major problem was we didn't speak English, so we had to learn English first. And they sorted it out, enough English to actually get it working within 2 weeks. Now, if there's that sort of talent floating around, if Muhammad Yunus can give microloans to 500,000 beggars in Bangladesh, $18 worth of microloans, and these people turn into entrepreneurs. These are the what do they call them? The untouchables, the lowest rank of society. Now, if these people can do it, and they've received a little bit of encouragement, they become part of a community, they become part of different type of thinking and a different type of value system. What are we missing? Because this world could be so much richer, and I don't mean richer for the 1%ers, it could be so much richer across the board in something that would be far more equitable than it is now.
And you're hitting on a lot of subjects that I also discuss sometimes on the breakfast table with my wife who's in the audience, that it's such a shame that so much of our attention is demanded by often trivial inventions. But yet, as people and as artists, and all of us both on stage and in the audience were artists, we have the ability and the need to tackle far bigger issues that are often maybe either not discussed because they're taboo, or just not discussed because often there is no appropriate desire to fund them. So it's interesting to hear you talk about these things. And you mentioned the word poverty, and it's interesting that for the last hour we didn't touch upon it, but it's such a key word. David,
just to kind of respond to what you said, I think a lot of times people feel powerless because here you've brought up this big word poverty, and then you talked about this idea of what are we doing about it, and so people maybe here or anywhere else might feel like, okay, this is a big thing, like what can I do? And in the last week when we were in Venezuela, we pulled up to a city called Coro, which is on the coast, and we pulled up to this house, and they said, if you're going to volunteer this week at this music program at this house, you're going to have to leave before the sun goes down because this is a really dangerous neighborhood. And I thought, perfect, this is exactly where I want to be. And I walked out of the van and I met this woman, Isandra Campos. And a year before I met her, she had moved, the house that I was going into was her house, but she moved out of her house with her 5 kids and with her mother so that the kids on that street could have orchestra at her house 7 days a week. And one of the days that I was there, she took me to the back of the house, and she had a bunch of chickens, and she made me pick chicken eggs, something I had never done. And so I felt like I was on an Easter egg hunt, and so she said, hey, do you know what I do with these eggs? And I said, well, there's a lot of kids here. Maybe you scramble them. I don't know. And she said, no, I sell them. And she told me that she sold each of the eggs for $1 bolivar each, and that's how she bought the music. Like, she didn't have music stands, they used the back of their cases. And for me, that was a huge moment because it showed me that there was kind of no excuse. Because this woman, she had a house and she had chickens. And so she moved out of her house and with her mother, and now she had a space for the students. And then she didn't have any money, but she had chickens. So she said, okay, I'll just sell the eggs. And it just really showed me. So I thought, you know what, for me, there's no excuse. Where am I going to move out of my house, or on behalf of what community am I going to sell chicken eggs? And so I don't think we have to be powerless. in the face of these big issues of our day.
I'd just like to add, I completely agree, and I think we have to be activists, in fact. And I think everyone here has spoken about approaching, without using the word activism, but we have approached the issues we are addressing as activists, and that's what it takes. There's a component of educating people about whatever the need is that we are trying to address, and then doing the work and keeping it all going. It's activist work, and that's what activists do. Address very difficult issues, one step at a time.
Well, and if nothing else, sometimes I tell our students here, engage in these issues even if you're selfish, because great art is inspired by this sense of injustice, whether it's done onto you or injustice that you witness. And often I feel, especially in higher education, we tend to insulate our students from the broader issues. And especially in music schools, I feel that there is people will often refer to it as a Berkeley bubble. But it's by bursting that bubble that as an artist you get inspired, and as an entrepreneur you're far more likely to innovate if you go out there and experience what's going on. And also I think the panel is touching on some interesting topics around the fact that entrepreneurialism and I think creativity or musicianship is something that we all share. But entrepreneurship, for me, it's the creation of opportunity for you and for others. And I do feel that the two, artistry or creativity and entrepreneurialism, share the same DNA, because to be an entrepreneur is to be a creator. You venture. I mean, entrepreneurship truly means to venture. One last question that I want to make sure we open it up for questions before folks have to go to their next class. Why is it that even though we acknowledge the role that arts and music play in our society, even down to MIT researchers recently publishing a report that there is actually a very part of our brain that's specifically designed for receiving musical signals. It's separate from speech, it's separate from any other sense that we have. The article is called The Music Room. So we know that music is not just a luxury, it's something that is embedded, hard-coded, if you will, into our operating system as people. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Why is it that we're also dealing with the same environment that's routinely taking money away from initiatives like this? So we know that music plays a role in our health, plays a role in educating us, plays a role in, I would say, even maintaining a democratic society. If there is no music, is there a democracy? If there's no art, is there a democracy? Right? And you can even answer that question that many repressive regimes, the first group of people they start to repress is artists, because artistry is liberation. Why is it that we don't appreciate it from a funding standpoint, especially in this country? Why are arts routinely underfunded?
Well, I'd like to speak to that for a moment. I think we're certainly looking at that problem in this country, not only in terms of funding, but in terms of infrastructure. Ours is, I believe, the only, if not one of the only countries not to have a minister of culture. I mean, when we look at the way that the arts are viewed in terms of representation, it's obviously lacking. And to go back to a point that was made earlier, 1% is the number, right? 1%, I believe they came out with the statistic around the time that Davos was going on, because I remember being there and being astonished. 1% of the population on this planet holds more wealth than the other 99. And I think that specifically boils down to something like 64 families who hold the world's wealth. So to me, the way that I look at this question, Panos, is maybe a three-prong approach. First of all, I have to ask, what is the role of arts in society today? And I've had to have that very clearly defined for myself in order to make the argument when I advocate, when I perform, or when I'm acting as an entrepreneur. I believe that the most important thing is the artist must ask the big questions. We have a responsibility, and responsibility is another word that sort of comes to mind, whether it's what is the responsibility of the 1%, what is the responsibility of the artist, what is our responsibility as global citizens. So I really feel that it's our duty, our civic duty as artists, to pose these big questions, to be a mirror to our audiences, to ask questions of humanity, of social justice, etc. Now, the other two questions specifically relate to how can I contribute? And one is, what is my ROI? What makes me, what's my specific vehicle where I can contribute the most to society? So I've had to think about that in terms of my own experience. Who am I is really the question that I'm asking. And the second question that goes with that is, where can I be of most value in society? I think we're living at a time where we have this surplus of artists, of musicians. We all know the statistics of how many graduate from music schools every year and how many actually land a steady gig, let's say, in a symphony or a ballet or an opera company. We know there's a surplus of artists, but there's a deficit in society of the intrinsic qualities, values the artist can add, whether it's creativity, imagination, passion-driven learning, or just the discipline that most artists bring to everything that they do. So being able to look at both of those questions, who am I, where can I add value, and where's the hole in society that I can fit into, having answered the question, what is the role of arts in society? That's the approach that I've taken in forming my nonprofit, which I just want to state, because I didn't talk too much about it, but essentially what I'm looking at are two key points. One is the challenges that classical music are facing, and I really think it goes back to storytelling, but we all know the statistics regarding how difficult it is for classical and traditional arts to engage audiences today, but also the challenges having to do with the demographics that I mentioned in terms of culture. And my mission and my approach with this has been, number one, not only to create events that break the traditional platform. In other words, I want events where there's conversation, where there's dialogue with the audience and storytelling. But I've also borrowed in a very casual way from Tom's model, the 1+1 model, in that for every event that I hope to curate through my organization, I hope to do an event in an underserved community, which allows me the chance, hopefully, to partner with organizations such as the ones here today and others in giving back. So that's been the approach that I've taken. I think we all have to ask these questions, and that search takes a long time. And I know for me was very much sort of through solitude and asking questions and listening. And what I really applaud about Panos, your work, and the panel here today is that we're able to have a conversation together. And that's rare. There are not enough institutions really leading that discussion right now. And it's so relevant going back to the surplus deficit that I described earlier.
Yeah, and of course, we recently announced our merger with the Boston Conservatory. The exciting aspect of that is the merging of two institutions that have very different cultural heritages. And what does that present? And to some degree, Carla, you've hit on an interesting point about this concept of surplus and deficit. And, somebody told me the only difference between an engineer right now and a musician is that if you finish with an engineering degree, even if you're in the top 50th percentile, you still have a good chance of making a decent amount of money and a decent living, even if you're kind of not that good. If you're a musician, unless you're at the top 99th percentile, the chances of you having a fulfilling career is tough. So part of the objective with the Institute is in many ways to broaden, again, that mindset. And if we create more of a demand for these skills that musicians have, which you all exemplify, that go beyond just the mere entertainment element of what music does, but also all these different permutations. I think that we are broadening the ability for musicians to not just generate a living, but also to impact society in different ways. Well, I want to open it up to everybody for questions. We have another 10, 15 minutes, but I'd like to give you the chance to ask any of our panelists some of your own questions. Yes, is there a microphone in the audience so we can give? We have an extra one. Thank you, Tony. Always inventive.
I made it earlier.
Hey, hi, I am from Singapore and I'm very inspired by our Sistema. Started my own.
Are you a Berkeley student?
Yeah, I'm a Berkeley
And
student.
what's your major?
Jazz composition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm in my 7th semester. So started my own initiative back home, but I face a lot of difficulty, because I think my question is how do you, in the event that if there's no government support for your initiative and stuff, how do you work things around, and do you always need to have a government support and stuff?
May I respond to that? And I'm sure David would also like to jump in. First of all, I love Singapore. I lived in Singapore for 3 years, and it's a great nation state, and I have very fond memories of it when I was a boy. No, you don't need to think of support only coming from government. I should explain. I am American. I'm an American citizen. So when you said that most of us are American, I think we're all American.
I'm not yet.
You're not yet.
I just filed to become a citizen because I'm sick and tired of all the Mickey Mouse stuff that's going on with the election. So I will vote. I'm committed to vote.
Yeah, that was my motivation as well. 2009 was the turning point for me. I've lived in both the subsidized system and I've lived in the philanthropic system. Philanthropic system here, America leads the world in philanthropy. Philanthropic dollars raised last year were, in 2014, were worth $350 billion. That is higher than the GDP of the largest African state. Can you just imagine that? Of that, about 17 or 18 billion dollars went into the arts. And the reason it went into the arts is because there is an indirect subsidy from government, which is based upon this strange thing in America, which is you don't like government at all, and you want to make decisions yourselves. Imagine that. So the founding fathers came up with something that allows you to make up your own mind, which makes America the democratic leader that it is in the world. Stay with that one. When I lived and worked in England, I used to get money for the orchestras that I ran from central government. And there was a minister for the arts. Awful. It's a system based upon politics, not based upon philanthropy. So the answer to your question is, and Singapore, I think, inherited so much from my mother country but nevertheless, Singapore has a great deal of wealth. It has a great deal of interest in culture and in music. It also has a great deal of need. My suggestion to you, and David, you jump in, my suggestion to you is, first of all, don't just have an idea and keep it to yourself. Share the idea, get supporters around you, get a network operating, start to identify people of influence who can actually come in and help with such an idea. Because if you choose that network carefully, they will get it. And they will be there with capacity, I mean financial capacity, to actually help you with that.
I completely agree. A huge lesson I learned from my life, my former life on YouTube, was that there's an audience for everyone. And like someone said, the 15 minutes of fame, you can have a day, the whole day could be a day of fame. And the thing I learned, this idea that anyone can make it in a sense is there's an audience out there interested in almost anything that someone has to offer, and it's finding that group of people. And one of the things I wish music schools taught more is how to build an audience. One of the things music schools, I call it the old model. So the old model is you go in the practice room, you practice all day, and then the venue has an audience attached to it. And so you go to the venue and you think you have an audience, but it's actually the audience of the venue. And so many people are operating under that old model rather than building their own audience, building a community of supporters around what they already have. And so when I was at the New England Conservatory and the fellowship, and I was deciding to stay in Boston, so many people said, how are you going to compete with everyone else fighting for the same pool of money? And I didn't really know how I was going to compete, but I just knew that I was a different person. And after I graduated, I discovered Cambridge, and I discovered a part of Cambridge called Kendall Square, where all the tech entrepreneurs hang out. And I started going to their meetups every week. And I started being asked to speak at tech events, and I started to be a part of the entrepreneurial community because I branded myself as an entrepreneur, and so now the audience around my orchestra is a different audience. It's people interested in music, people interested in the social aspect of how music can help kids, but it's not the Boston Symphony audience. It's a completely different group of people. And when my orchestra has concerts where we're new, only 3 years old, there's maybe 50, 100 people there. They're young professionals, super excited about music, and they'll never step foot in Symphony Hall. But our orchestra is now their connection to orchestral music, and these young people from Roxbury are the avenue by which they can enjoy that. And so building your own audience around what you're doing is really powerful, and I think everyone in here should do that around whatever you're doing.
Other questions? Gigi over here has a question. My fellow Greek.
Thank you. I just have a quick question as to how much influence does this provide outside of the niche market? Or is it basic? Because what it seems to me is that this is going to start creating small segregated communities, right? And they will evolve, they will grow, but then how do you connect everyone together? Because I mean, I get the bridge, of course, and music is the bridge to everything, but then how do you create the highway to reach the masses, then get the message out to everyone else? Because it's the same that's going on with the environment, right? You have all these conferences and you keep getting the same people over and over again, so you keep educating the same people. But then how do you get the message across to everyone else without losing their credibility?
Well, I think the perfect person to answer that is Matt Wilson, in fact. The executive director of Mass Creates, which is an advocacy organization addressing this issue specifically with a lot of city and state and national advocacy work around the arts, connecting arts organizations. Matt and I had a conversation recently about, in fact, he was an environmental activist for many, many years before he became an arts activist. And the issue of arts organizations being in their own silos is a very important one. I don't know if would you like to say something to this, Matt? Because you have many things to... We're lucky to have you here to address
Putting
this.
you on the spot.
And we're sharing our resources, which is one of the things we should all do.
Hi, I think your question is great, and I think one of our problems is that the arts community has kind of been its only spokesperson for the past, and we've siloed ourselves and look inward, and I think a lot of what you guys have been talking about is developing partnerships with outside of our sector and having those folks talking for us and speaking for us and broadening it. Most of the advocacy that had been done in the arts community was what I'd call like grass tops advocacy. It's the leaders of the community who are out there fighting for it. And what we're trying to do is make it more of a grassroots thing. So it's ordinary folks. So it's your neighbor and your sister-in-law and your brother-in-law who is looking at this as a passion, just like environmentalists do, like who have a passion for clean water or clean air. People have a passion for all what folks have been talking about about creativity, about social service, and we just have to expand it. It's, your point is right on target. It can't be us. We need to be leading it, yet we need to broaden our base of political support, so we're not the add-on, that this is integral into everything that we're doing.
And also what's interesting is that there is a study out there called the Startup Genome Project. And it shows that there is no such thing as an innovation hub without a correspondingly robust cultural hub, cultural scene. But I think that often within governments, you find that these initiatives tend to be led by different people and done almost independently of one another. So you will see, for example, cities, and I'm involved in a lot of these initiatives, both in my home country and here. They'll spend a lot of money on entrepreneurialism, on innovation, on all the buzzwords, but they'll take money away from the arts. And at least one of the things that I keep pushing is that everybody needs to understand. I think as an artist, we should insert ourselves in those conversations, because art is a powerful magnet of innovative minds, and it's a powerful enabler of entrepreneurialism, of innovation, of creation, and an economic driver. And often we tend to look at art as an economic benefactor, or a recipient, or a sucker sometimes, if you will, rather than as a creator and an enabler. And this is a key message that as a philanthropic community, as an artistic community, we need to put out there. And I just don't think that to everybody's point, we tend to hang out with the same people over and over again, but not necessarily create situations that bring these communities together. And it's one of the ambitions that we have with this institute, and it's one of the ambitions, and I think the unique advantages that Boston has. I cannot think of another city on the planet that brings together amongst its colleges so many diverse people. I mean, just between Berkeley, New England Conservatory, Emerson, Mass Art, School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Longy, I'm sure I'm forgetting a few. We have over 10,000 creative students within 3 square mile radius. And then you don't have to go that far from here to encounter Harvard and MIT and Tufts and Boston College and all these other universities who bring together a very different skill set of people. And I think that as Boston, we have a unique opportunity to unleash this potential that, admittedly, I don't think we've done very, very well.
I think it's very true of the arts, and I think that the position that the arts finds itself in is a direct result of our carelessness. We have not done enough. We have decided that we'll only talk to a small audience that we have defined as being our core audience, and that those are the people who are educated enough to understand what we're doing. I was bemoaning this to some friends recently, and one of my friends said, "Yeah, but it's great." I said, "What do you mean it's great? We're in a dire position. We're an endangered species." And he said, "Yeah, but it can't get any worse." And we have the opportunity now to do something about it. And you know, he's right. This is an inflection point where we can, listening to everyone speak this afternoon, nobody is talking about status quo here. Everyone is talking about social responsibility, social change, poverty, the place of the arts, how we can advocate for the arts far more effectively. It's there. The battle, it's not even a battle really, the persuasion, the soft power that we represent is there for us to do the most wonderful good for the widest society.
Well, and I think that's your charge as young people who come to this college. I like to say that part of my job is to elevate our collective ambition as a college in terms of what we produce. So we're not just producing artists, but we're producing citizens who have a responsibility to go out there and instigate change, drive change, think beyond not just their instrument and their phone, but beyond the stage. And I think that's the power that we all collectively bring. One more question. Okay. And introduce yourself too. Where are you from?
Good afternoon. My name is Ariel Huang. I'm from South Africa. I was privileged enough to be in the final and the fifth and final class of the NEC Sistema Fellows program. And since graduation, I've pretty much traveled the world doing different teaching residencies and spending time very intentionally outside of music to look at if we're trying to do social change, art activism, and culture diplomacy. What does that look like in organizations that have had track record of doing this very well, but not through the arts? I haven't come up with my sort of 30-second elevator pitch answer yet, but I'm noticing a lot of burnout. I'm noticing a lot of fatigue. I'm noticing a lot of people that deeply care about this, but have no place to turn or no particular space or community to go to reflect, to ask for help, to maybe call it pause, maybe call it quits, and also perhaps the institutions that are leading and heading these buzzwords of creative entrepreneurship, of artist-driven social change, in terms of responsibility of bringing us, the new generation of civic artists out into the world. Are we comfortable talking about failure? Are we comfortable in terms of, what does it mean to set up a startup successfully, and what happens when we don't have a place to go to, or when it's really tough, and when it's time to call it career pivot? I mean, that's something that I'm discovering, when it's okay to, I can't perform anymore. I don't want to teach because I can't supplement my income as a performer, or when my startup or my for-profit or not-for-profit is not going so well. So in terms of institutional responsibility and self-care, can some of you maybe talk about that? Thank you very much.
I'll jump in, and actually, Carla, go ahead. And then
I'm so passionate about this. Thank you so much for asking the question or just bringing this subject to the forefront. I totally empathize with every word you just said. It's not easy, and failure will be a part of it. I come back to a quote that inspires me every day by Georgia O'Keeffe, saying, "I wasn't interested in doing what had been done before." And this is basically my story. I think that the biggest thing that we can do right now to help one another is create that community. And that's the buzzword, I guess, that I got from the question previously, is how do we define community? What is community? What is community for us, the next generation, the generation that is the former generation, in passing along these lessons and helping one another? A few things. Number one, I do feel like 9 out of 10 times when I've asked for help, asked for a coffee, asked for a conversation, most people in our artistic community or beyond will give me the time. And that in and of itself is a huge gift in creating a network, in learning, in acquiring resources, so forth. So I just put this out there for anyone in the audience. Please look at me as a resource. I am available. I'm happy to give you my email, my phone number, whatever. So many people have done it for me, and I'm very, very glad to do it for all of you. And I believe that is the spirit that should be passed down. Secondly, I think one of the big battles that we're fighting here is a mistrust of institutions all around. Whether it's government, our electoral system, going back to the Gore election, whether it's academia or even marriage. I mean, times are changing and technology plays a role in that. But certainly in terms of artistic institutions, this is a challenge for all of us. And the way that I'm trying to approach that is to create trust, and I start with listening. I go back to that each and every single time. It's hard. It's extremely hard financially, and this is the piece that we don't talk about as much. But again, please ask for my email, and I'm happy to talk about it. As an artist, I've basically scaled back. This is my first season, really scaling back the amount of performances that I'm accepting in order to focus and build the nonprofit. And of course that means a loss. And so how do I do that responsibly? And what if it fails? Then what am I left with? So I've had to go out and seek advice from people that have been willing to give it to me. And all I can say is what I have found is incredible support within this community, from major national organizations, AFTA, TED, Aspen, the list goes on, to individuals that are, artists at the forefront of working with people every day and seeing that change. And it's that spirit of kindness and grace that I think makes me want to keep going forward and be a part of it. So I can only offer myself, but please, I really mean it, cdurlakov@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out to me at any time, and any of the lessons that I have learned, or if I can put you in touch with someone who I think might be a resource or a friend to you, I'm very, very happy to do that.
I'd like to add to that one thing I've encountered in doing this work is that reaching out really does work. And to Matt's point about creating more cross-partnerships, cross-cultural and cross-discipline partnerships, I've found that like you, when I've reached out to people who aren't artists, who are in the social service world, who are in the philanthropy world, and said, I'd love to get your advice on this. I'm puzzling through something. People want to have interesting conversations, and I too would say I am happy to be a resource. I love it when people call up and say, how'd you figure this out? And I said, well, I'm still trying to figure it out, but let's talk about it together, because every conversation actually creates energy and can lead to something else. And one great lesson I've learned in doing this work is that sharing of resources means we all win. So even if we're all competing for exactly the same grant, which happens. In fact, there's Betsy. Betsy Hinkle and I were competing for the Social Innovation Forum program, and Shelter Music Boston, my organization, was selected. Now, Betsy and I have become great friends and resources for each other, and share resources back and forth and advocate for each other's organizations, because when her organization does well, mine does well. The work proceeds, and so in that way we can really support each other by sharing.
And it's an interesting point. When I was running my business before starting this, when people asked me who my competition was, I always worried if my answer was no one, that was actually not a good thing at all. That means I was just barking up I don't know what tree. But if there's competition, this means there is room for change, for growth, right? But then to answer at one key point, you talked about failure and fear. We all have that. I don't think there's a human being who is not afraid of failure. But to quote Eleanor Roosevelt, do something every day that scares you. And being able to overcome that is so important. And I think that and I think all of us here are musicians, we somehow take failure as part of our musical journey or musical learning journey as endemic to the process, right? We know that the first time we try any new piece, the first time we pick up any instrument, we're going to fail at it. And we accepted that it's just part of it's part of the ongoing process. As a matter of fact, you always fail, but you fail towards eventual success. But somehow when it comes to our enterprises, we tend to shy away from that. We feel that failure is something that we shouldn't even touch or be concerned with embarking down a journey that may lead us to failure. But to me, that's the biggest failure, not starting something and being afraid of it, and being afraid so much that you don't do something about it. So I don't think it's failure that's the issue. I don't think that it's fear of failure that's the issue. I think it's the fear of starting out something that may fail. That's the issue. But if we accept it, that it's just part of the journey and part of what's going to lead us to something that is worthwhile, and we don't always know what that is, then we'll be better for it. Well, thanks everyone for sticking with us for the last couple of hours. Thank you to my fellow panelists. This was awesome. I'm deeply grateful for knowing each and every one of you. We all know each other because we kind of reached out to one another precisely for this reason, that we are a community. So please give a big round of applause to everyone.